I never imagined that painting my front door navy blue would lead to a six-figure lawsuit funded by my own neighbors. But that's exactly what happened when I moved into Meadowbrook Estates in Scottsdale, Arizona. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, slipped into my mailbox like a ticking time bomb wrapped in official HOA letterhead. I was sipping my coffee on the patio, enjoying the desert sunrise, when I noticed the thick envelope practically bursting at the seams. Inside was a 20-page document informing me that the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was suing me for violations of community standards and that I owed them $375 as my share of the legal costs. My share. Those two words stuck in my mind like a splinter. I read the letter 3 times, each pass making my blood pressure rise a little higher. According to the document, signed by none other than Patricia Hendricks, the HOA president, I had violated Section 14.3 of the Community Guidelines by painting my door without prior approval, installing unapproved house numbers, placing decorative rocks in my front yard that exceeded the permitted size, and maintaining a vehicle in my driveway that violated the aesthetic standards of the community. That last one really got me because I drove a perfectly normal Honda Accord that was 3 years old and in excellent condition. The lawsuit was seeking damages of $150,000, plus legal fees, plus the cost of returning my property to compliance. And here was the kicker. The board had voted to assess every single homeowner in the community to fund this legal action. There were 240 homes in Meadowbrook Estates, which meant they were collecting $90,000 from the residents to sue one of their own residents. The math alone was absurd. I immediately called my neighbor, Derek Foster, who lived 2 doors down. Derek was a retired accountant who had lived in the community for 8 years and generally kept his head down when it came to HOA drama. "Did you get one of these letters?" I asked when he picked up. There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "Yeah, Zachary, I got mine yesterday. I was going to call you, but honestly I didn't know what to say. This whole thing is insane. They're billing everyone to sue me over a door color?" "It's not just that, apparently. Patricia has been on a warpath about your property since you moved in. She brought it up at the last 3 board meetings. I go to those sometimes, just to stay informed. She's got this whole presentation about how your non-compliance is bringing down property values." I felt my jaw clench. "My house looks fine, better than fine. I've spent $20,000 on landscaping and exterior improvements since I bought the place 6 months ago." "I know that. Most people know that. But Patricia has Sharon Brennan and Linda Walsh backing her up, and the 3 of them are the majority of the board. Mike Torres and Jennifer Kim are the other 2 members, and they've basically been steamrolled." I thanked Derek and hung up, my mind already racing. This wasn't just about my door or my house numbers or my supposedly offensive rocks. This was about control. Patricia Hendricks had been the HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed in every election because most people couldn't be bothered to get involved. She'd turned the position into her own personal fiefdom, and I had apparently committed the cardinal sin of not asking for her blessing before making changes to my own property. The thing was, I'd actually checked the CC and Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed the community, before making any changes. The document was 73 pages long and written in dense legal language, but I'd read through it carefully. Nowhere did it specify that navy blue was an unapproved door color. The rules stated that doors should be painted in colors that complement the home's exterior and fit within the desert aesthetic of the community. My house was a light tan stucco with brown trim. Navy blue complemented it perfectly. The house numbers were another manufactured problem. I'd replaced the cheap plastic numbers that came with the house with elegant brushed brass numbers that were actually easier to read from the street. The decorative rocks in my front yard were river rocks that I'd arranged around my desert plants to help with water retention and erosion control, a common practice in Arizona landscaping. And my Honda Accord, there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. I spent the rest of the day researching Arizona HOA law. I learned that HOAs in Arizona have broad powers, but they're not unlimited. They have to follow their own governing documents, they have to provide due process to homeowners, and they have to act in good faith. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this lawsuit was not just petty, but potentially illegal. By evening, I drafted a response letter and scheduled an appointment with an attorney named Robert Chen who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Scottsdale, in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Camelback Mountain. When I met with him 2 days later, I brought copies of everything: the lawsuit notice, the assessment letter, photos of my property, the CC and Rs, and a timeline of every interaction I'd had with the HOA board. Robert was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of neighborhood conflict. He reviewed my materials with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "This is interesting," he said after about 20 minutes. "Very interesting." Interesting good or interesting bad? Interesting as in, I think we have several strong defenses and potentially grounds for a countersuit. He tapped his pen on the assessment letter. "First, let's talk about this special assessment. Did the board hold a vote of the membership before imposing it?" "Not that I know of. The letter says the board voted to approve it, but there's no mention of a homeowner vote." Robert flipped through the CC and Rs, found the section he was looking for, and turned the document so I could see. "Right here. Any special assessment over $50 per household requires a majority vote of the membership. Not just the board. They can't unilaterally decide to bill everyone $375. I felt a surge of hope. "So the assessment is invalid?" "Almost certainly, but it gets better. Look at the itemized breakdown they're required to provide for any assessment." He showed me the relevant section. They have to explain exactly what the funds will be used for, provide an estimated timeline, and give homeowners at least 30 days to respond before collection begins. This letter does none of that. It just demands payment within 15 days. "What about the actual lawsuit? Do they have a case?" Robert leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Based on what you've shown me, it's extremely weak. Your door color is within the acceptable range under a reasonable interpretation of the CC and Rs. Your house numbers are an improvement over the standard ones. The rocks are a normal landscaping element, and your vehicle is a standard passenger car in good condition. I don't see how they prove any of these things violate the rules, let alone cause damages." "So what do? We respond to the lawsuit with a strong defense, and we file a motion to invalidate the special assessment. But here's what I really think you should do. Request a full accounting of how the HOA has spent this collected money and any other funds. Something about this whole situation smells off to me. Patricia Hendricks is either completely incompetent, which is possible, or there's something else going on." I left Robert's office feeling better than I had in days, but also curious. What did he mean by something else going on? That evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by reading through the last 2 years of HOA meeting minutes, which were posted on the community website in disorganized PDF files. The first thing I noticed was that the meetings had become shorter and less detailed over time. 2 years ago, the minutes included robust discussions of community maintenance, financial reports, and homeowner concerns. But over the past year, they'd shrunk to barely a page each, with vague references to executive sessions and closed discussions. Then, I found something that made me sit up straight. In a meeting from 8 months ago, there was a single line item: approved retention of Hendricks Legal Services for ongoing community legal needs. I immediately searched for Hendricks Legal Services online. The firm was owned and operated by Thomas Hendricks, Esquire. A little more digging revealed that Thomas Hendricks was married to Patricia Hendricks. The HOA president had hired her husband's law firm to represent the community, and now that firm was billing the community for a lawsuit that seemed designed to generate legal fees rather than actually resolve any legitimate problem. This was the something else Robert had sensed. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to Robert that night. He called me first thing the next morning, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "This is a serious conflict of interest," he said. "She should have disclosed the relationship and recused herself from the vote to hire his firm. And if she's using HOA funds to enrich her husband's practice by manufacturing legal disputes, that's potentially fraud. What's our next move?" "We go on offense. I'm going to file a motion to dismiss the lawsuit based on its lack of merit, a motion to invalidate the assessment, and a demand for a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. And I think you should start talking to your neighbors. If Patricia has done this to you, she's probably been abusing her position in other ways. The more homeowners we can get on our side, the stronger our position becomes. That weekend, I printed up flyers explaining the situation in clear, simple terms. I didn't editorialize or make accusations beyond the facts. I laid out that the HOA was suing me over minor, arguably compliant home improvements. I explained that every homeowner was being billed $375 without a proper vote. I noted that the HOA president's husband owned the law firm representing the community, and I invited anyone with concerns to contact me or attend the next board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I spent Saturday and Sunday walking the neighborhood, introducing myself to people I hadn't met yet, and having longer conversations with those I knew. The response was overwhelming. Most people had no idea about the assessment until they'd received the letter. Many were angry about being billed without consultation, and quite a few had their own horror stories about Patricia Hendricks. One couple, the Rodriguezes, told me they'd been fined $2,000 over the course of a year for parking violations that they insisted never happened. They'd eventually paid just to make it stop, even though they believed the fines were bogus. Another homeowner, an elderly woman named Margaret, said she'd been threatened with a lien on her home because she'd planted the wrong type of flowers in her front yard. She'd dug them up and replaced them with approved plants, but the experience had left her terrified of the HOA. By Monday evening, I'd spoken with over 60 households, and at least 40 had expressed interest in attending the board meeting. I spent Monday night preparing my own statement, focusing on facts and documentation rather than emotion. The board meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the pool and tennis courts. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 5 or 6 people. That Tuesday evening, over 80 homeowners showed up. The small meeting room was packed, with people standing along the walls and sitting on the floor. Patricia Hendricks looked stunned when she walked in and saw the crowd. She was exactly what you'd expect. A woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob, expensive athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. Sharon Brennan and Linda Walsh flanked her like bodyguards. Mike Torres and Jennifer Kim, the other 2 board members, looked nervous but not necessarily unhappy about the turnout. Patricia called the meeting to order, her voice tight. "We have quite a crowd tonight. I hope everyone signed in as required." "We're here about the assessment," someone called out from the back. Several people murmured in agreement. "The special assessment is a board decision and not up for debate," Patricia said crisply. "We have a legal obligation to defend the community standards, and that requires funding." I raised my hand. "I'd like to speak during the homeowner comment period." Patricia's eyes narrowed when she saw me. "Mr. Mason, I suppose I should have expected you to be the ringleader of this circus." "I just invited people to participate in their HOA," I said evenly. "That's what these meetings are for, right?" She glared at me, but continued with the standard opening procedures, clearly hoping to bore people into leaving. But no one moved. When we finally reached the homeowner comment section of the agenda, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "My name is Zachary Mason, and I'm the homeowner being sued by the HOA," I began. "I've lived here for 6 months, and in that time, I've done my best to maintain and improve my property within the guidelines. I've reviewed the CC and RS carefully, and I believe I'm in compliance. But even if there was a legitimate dispute, the way this lawsuit has been handled raises serious concerns." I pulled out my documentation. First, the special assessment was imposed without a vote of the membership, which violates our governing documents. Any assessment over $50 requires majority approval. Second, the board hired Hendricks Legal Services to represent the community. That firm is owned by Thomas Hendricks, who is married to Patricia Hendricks, our board president. This relationship was never disclosed, and Patricia never recused herself from the decision to hire her husband's firm. The room erupted in shocked conversation. Patricia's face went bright red. "That's a personal attack, and I won't stand for it." "It's a statement of fact," I said calmly. "Thomas Hendricks's business registration and marriage license are public records. This is a clear conflict of interest, and it raises questions about whether this lawsuit is really about protecting community standards or about generating legal fees." "How dare you?" Patricia sputtered. "I have served this community for 6 years without compensation, without appreciation, and this is the thanks I get? Accusations and conspiracy theories?" Mike Torres, one of the other board members, cleared his throat. "Patricia, I think these are legitimate questions. I didn't know about your husband's firm when we voted to hire them. You never mentioned the connection." "I don't have to justify my personal life to any of you," Patricia snapped. "Actually, under Arizona law you do," said a voice from the crowd. It was Robert Chen, my attorney, who'd come to observe the meeting. "Board members have a fiduciary duty to the association, and conflicts of interest must be disclosed. Failure to do so can result in personal liability." The meeting descended into chaos after that. Homeowners demanded answers. Patricia refused to engage, insisting that everything had been done properly. Sharon and Linda tried to defend her, but they couldn't explain away the conflict of interest. Jennifer Kim finally made a motion to suspend the special assessment pending a full review of the lawsuit and the board's decision-making process. Mike Torres seconded it immediately. Patricia tried to shut down the motion, but Robert stood up again. "Under Robert's Rules of Order, which your bylaws specify govern these meetings, a motion that's been made and seconded must be brought to a vote. You can't just ignore it." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but she was smart enough to know she was beaten on this point. "Fine. All in favor?" Mike and Jennifer voted yes. Patricia, Sharon, and Linda voted no. The motion failed, 3-2. But the crowd wasn't satisfied. Derek Foster stood up. "I move that we call a special meeting of the entire membership to vote on removing the board and electing a new one." "Second," said at least 5 people simultaneously. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. You can't just remove the board because you don't like one decision. We can if the board has violated the governing documents or breached its fiduciary duty," Robert said. "And based on what I've heard tonight, there are grounds for both." Someone else called out, "What about a forensic audit? I want to know where all our HOA fees have been going." That triggered another wave of demands. People wanted to see the financials. They wanted to know how much had been paid to Hendricks Legal Services. They wanted to review all the contracts and decisions made over the past 2 years. Patricia tried to regain control, but it was hopeless. The meeting ended with a commitment to hold a special membership meeting in 3 weeks, as required by the bylaws for any vote to remove board members. In the meantime, a group of homeowners, including myself, Derek, and a woman named Rachel, who worked as a CPA, volunteered to serve on a temporary oversight committee to review the HOA's finances. Over the next 3 weeks, we uncovered a pattern of questionable decisions and self-dealing that went way beyond the lawsuit against me. Patricia's husband's law firm had been paid over $60,000 in the past year for various legal services, many of which seemed unnecessary or inflated. The HOA had hired a property management company owned by Sharon Brennan's brother, paying them twice the market rate. Linda Walsh ran a landscaping business, and surprise, the HOA had recently switched to using her company for common area maintenance at premium prices. The 3 of them had turned the HOA board into a personal enrichment scheme, funneling community funds to their families and friends while keeping the rest of the homeowners in the dark with vague financial reports and minimal transparency. Rachel, the CPA, estimated that the HOA had overspent by at least $120,000 over the past 2 years due to these sweetheart deals. That money had come from our HOA fees, which had increased twice during Patricia's tenure, supposedly to cover rising maintenance costs. We compiled everything into a detailed report and made copies for every household in the community. The special membership meeting was held at a local hotel conference room, because we knew the community center wouldn't be big enough. Over 200 homeowners attended, representing more than 80% of the households. The meeting was intense. Patricia, Sharon, and Linda tried to defend themselves, arguing that all their decisions had been made in good faith and that the relationships in question were coincidental. No one was buying it. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious. When it came time to vote, the results were overwhelming. 192 homeowners voted to remove the entire existing board immediately. Only 8 voted to keep them in place, and I suspected at least a few of those were family members. We held elections on the spot for a new board. Mike Torres and Jennifer Kim were both re-elected, having been cleared of any wrongdoing. Derek Foster was elected as the new president, Rachel joined as treasurer, and a retired teacher named Harold Washington was elected as the fifth member. The new board's first action was to vote unanimously to terminate the lawsuit against me. Their second action was to invalidate the special assessment and refund anyone who had already paid. Their third action was to terminate all the Sweetheart contracts and put new services out for competitive bid. But we weren't done yet. Robert Chen advised that the former board member's conduct likely constituted fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The new board voted to file a civil suit against Patricia, Sharon, and Linda to recover the misspent funds. Additionally, Robert helped us file a complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office, which has jurisdiction over HOA fraud. The Attorney General's office took the case seriously. They opened an investigation and within 2 months brought charges against all 3 former board members for fraud, theft, and abuse of their fiduciary positions. Thomas Hendricks was also charged as an accomplice for his role in billing excessive legal fees. The criminal case took about a year to wind through the system. I had to testify at several hearings, laying out the timeline of how I'd uncovered the scheme and what we'd found in the financial review. It was nerve-wracking, but also satisfying. These people had treated the HOA like their personal piggy bank, and they were finally being held accountable. In the end, Patricia Hendricks pleaded guilty to fraud and theft charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay restitution of $75,000. Sharon Brennan and Linda Walsh took plea deals for lesser charges, receiving probation, community service, and restitution orders. Thomas Hendricks was disbarred and pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges, receiving 2 years of probation. The civil suit resulted in a settlement where the 3 former board members and Thomas collectively paid $190,000 to the HOA, covering both the misspent funds and our legal costs in pursuing the case. Throughout all of this, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The new board operated with radical transparency, posting detailed financial reports every month and holding quarterly town halls where any homeowner could ask questions or raise concerns. HOA fees were actually reduced once we renegotiated all the service contracts at fair market rates. My navy blue door remained navy blue, and my Honda Accord remained parked in my driveway. No one complained. In fact, several other homeowners painted their doors in different colors once they realized the CC&Rs actually allowed for personal expression within reasonable bounds. Derek turned out to be an excellent HOA president, bringing people together rather than ruling by fiat. Rachel kept the finances in impeccable order, and we never had to wonder where our money was going. The community felt like an actual community for the first time since I'd moved in. About 18 months after the initial lawsuit letter had landed in my mailbox, I was out front working on my yard when a couple pulled up in a moving truck. They were looking at the house across the street, which had just gone up for sale. The woman rolled down her window. "Excuse me, do you live here? What's the neighborhood like?" I smiled. "It's great, actually. Really friendly community. The HOA is well run and reasonable. You'll like it here." She looked relieved. "That's so good to hear. We were worried because we've heard so many HOA horror stories." "I think every neighborhood has one," I said. "The key is making sure the board is accountable to the homeowners. We learned that lesson the hard way, but we're better for it now." They thanked me and drove off, and I went back to arranging some new plants in my front bed. As I worked, I thought about everything that had happened. It had been stressful and time-consuming, and there were moments when I'd wondered if it was worth the fight. But looking around at the neighborhood now, knowing that we'd rooted out corruption and built something better, I knew the answer was yes. The whole experience had taught me that HOAs aren't inherently good or bad. They're just organizations, and like any organization, they reflect the people running them. When those people abuse their power, it takes courage and effort from ordinary residents to hold them accountable. Most people don't want to get involved in neighborhood drama or fight with their HOA board. I certainly hadn't wanted to. But sometimes circumstances demand that you stand up, not just for yourself, but for everyone affected by injustice. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates looking for a nice, quiet place to live. Instead, I'd found myself in the middle of a battle against corruption and self-dealing. But by fighting that battle, by refusing to accept that an HOA president could act with impunity, I'd helped create the nice, quiet community I'd wanted in the first place. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. The new board was meeting that evening to finalize plans for a neighborhood barbecue and pool party. It would be our second annual event, and last year's had been a huge success. I texted back that I'd be there and offered to help with setup. As the sun started to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I stood back and admired my house. The navy blue door gleamed in the golden light. The brushed brass numbers caught the sun's rays. The river rocks in my landscaping created interesting shadows and textures. My 3-year-old Honda Accord sat faithfully in the driveway. Everything that had started this entire saga was still exactly as it had been, but everything else had changed completely. And that, I thought as I headed inside to clean up before the board meeting, was exactly how it should be. The legal proceedings had wrapped up completely by spring of the following year. The Arizona Attorney General's office closed its investigation with a commendation for our community's diligence in reporting the fraud. The restitution payments were deposited into the HOA account, and the new board used the funds to complete several deferred maintenance projects, including resurfacing the tennis courts and upgrading the pool equipment. I received a formal letter from the HOA attorney, not from Thomas Hendricks, but from a new firm the board had hired through a proper bidding process. The letter confirmed that all claims against me had been dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. It also included an apology, which the new board had insisted on, acknowledging that the lawsuit should never have been brought in the first place. Robert Chen, who had become something of a local legend in HOA dispute circles, wrote an article about the case for a legal journal. He used it as a teaching example of how conflicts of interest can corrupt even small community organizations and how important transparency and accountability are in governance. He sent me a copy with a note thanking me for being willing to fight rather than just pay the bogus fines and roll over. The article brought some attention to Meadowbrook Estates, but not the kind Patricia had probably feared when she'd complained about property values. Our neighborhood became known as a model for HOA reform and good governance. When neighboring communities faced their own HOA disputes, they reached out to Derek and our board for advice. We were happy to share what we'd learned, hoping to help others avoid the pain we'd gone through. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I'd been promoted at work, partially because my boss was impressed with how I'd handled the HOA situation. He told me it showed leadership, strategic thinking, and the ability to build coalitions, all skills that translated well to my job in project management. I started dating someone I'd met at one of the neighborhood events, a woman named Sophie Oliver who lived 4 streets over. She was a veterinarian with a wicked sense of humor and a complete lack of patience for petty bureaucracy. When I told her the whole story of the HOA battle, she'd laughed until she cried and then said I was either the bravest or most stubborn person she'd ever met. I told her it was probably a mix of both. Sophie had her own small HOA horror story. She'd been fined $50 for putting up Christmas lights 3 days before the approved date. Unlike me, she'd just paid the fine because it seemed easier than fighting. But after hearing what I'd gone through and how it had ended, she admitted she wished she'd pushed back. "You changed this whole community," she said one evening as we sat on my back patio watching the sunset. "Most people would have just moved or given in." "I got lucky," I said. "I had good neighbors who were willing to support the fight. I had a great attorney, and the former board had been so blatant in their corruption that it wasn't hard to expose." "Don't downplay it," she said firmly. "You did something that mattered. A lot of people talk about standing up to injustice, but you actually did it." I appreciated her confidence, but I also knew she was giving me too much credit. The victory hadn't been mine alone. It had been a community effort, dozens of people who'd decided they'd had enough and were willing to put in the work to make things better. That summer, we held our neighborhood barbecue on a Saturday in June. The turnout was even bigger than the previous year. Someone had set up a volleyball net near the pool. Kids were running around playing tag while parents chatted and grilled burgers and hot dogs. Derek gave a short speech thanking everyone for their continued involvement and noting that the community had never been in better financial or social shape. As he spoke, I looked around at the faces in the crowd. There were the Rodriguezes, who no longer lived in fear of bogus parking tickets. There was Margaret, the elderly woman who'd been terrorized over her flower choices, now happily tending a garden full of whatever plants she wanted. There was Rachel, keeping a watchful eye on the HOA finances and ensuring every dollar was accounted for. And there were dozens of others, people who'd found their voice and their power as homeowners. Patricia Hendricks was serving her prison sentence in Perryville, about an hour outside of Phoenix. I didn't take any particular pleasure in that fact. I'd never wanted to see anyone go to jail. I just wanted to live in my house in peace and not be bilked for money to fund a frivolous lawsuit. But actions have consequences, and she'd made her choices. Sharon Brennan and Linda Walsh had moved away from Meadowbrook Estates, selling their homes and leaving Arizona entirely. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Sharon had moved back east to live with family, and Linda had relocated to Nevada. Their probation terms required regular check-ins with Arizona authorities, which meant they had to return periodically, but they'd clearly decided they couldn't face living in the community they'd tried to exploit. As fall approached, I realized I'd been living in Meadowbrook Estates for almost 2 years. It felt like a lifetime ago that I'd received that first threatening letter about my door color. The whole experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I was more engaged in my community now, more willing to speak up when something seemed wrong, and more confident in my ability to navigate complex situations. The new board continued to operate smoothly. Derek had proven to be a natural leader, someone who could bring people together and build consensus. When his first term was ending, there was a strong push for him to run for re-election, which he did. He won unanimously. The board had become so effective and transparent that for the first time in years, people actually wanted to serve on it. We had competitive elections with multiple qualified candidates for each open position. The lawsuit that had started everything became something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents would hear about it and ask for the full story. It became a cautionary tale about the importance of staying involved in your HOA and not letting any individual accumulate too much unchecked power. One afternoon, I was cleaning out my garage when I found the original lawsuit notice, the one that had arrived in my mailbox that Tuesday morning and started this entire chain of events. I held it in my hands, reading through the absurd claims and the demand for $375 to fund legal action against myself. It seemed almost surreal now, like something from another lifetime. Sophie found me standing there with the letter. "What's that?" "The original lawsuit notice. I'd forgotten I kept it." She read over my shoulder, shaking her head. "I still can't believe they thought they'd get away with this." "They've been getting away with other stuff for years," I said. "They just got too arrogant and made it too obvious." "What are you going to do with it?" I considered for a moment, then walked over to my recycling bin and dropped it in. "I don't need it anymore. It's done." And it was. The lawsuit was dismissed. The corrupt board was gone. The money was returned. Justice, in its imperfect way, had been served. There was no point in holding on to a piece of paper that represented one of the most stressful periods of my life. That winter, I ran for a position on the HOA board myself. It seemed like the natural next step. I'd been heavily involved in community affairs since the whole drama started, attending every board meeting and serving on various committees. Several neighbors encouraged me to run, saying I'd earned a voice in the formal governance structure. I won the election by a comfortable margin and joined the board in January. It was strange sitting on the other side of the table, being the one making decisions rather than the one demanding accountability. But I tried to bring the same principles to the role that I'd demanded from others: transparency, fairness, and a genuine commitment to serving the community rather than personal interests. My first few months on the board were a learning experience. There was a lot of mundane work involved in running an HOA, reviewing vendor contracts, planning maintenance schedules, responding to homeowner requests and complaints. Some of the complaints were legitimate, like concerns about broken streetlights or overgrown common areas. Others were petty, people upset about their neighbors' lawn ornaments or demanding that the HOA do something about a barking dog, which wasn't actually within our authority. I tried to handle each situation with patience and reason, remembering how it had felt to be on the receiving end of arbitrary HOA power. When someone requested approval for a home modification, I looked at whether it actually violated the rules rather than whether I personally liked it. When people had disputes, I encouraged them to work it out directly rather than trying to impose top-down solutions. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I understood just a little bit how someone could become a petty tyrant in Patricia's mold. When you're dealing with constant complaints and conflicts, when people are angry at you over things you can't control, there's a temptation to just start saying no to everything and asserting authority for its own sake. But I resisted that temptation, and so did the rest of the board. We kept each other honest and accountable. We operated in the open. We treated homeowners with respect. And slowly, the culture of the community continued to improve. By the time spring rolled around again, Meadowbrook Estates felt like a completely different place from the neighborhood I'd moved into 3 years earlier. People were friendlier. There was more community involvement. The fear and resentment that had characterized interactions with the HOA had been replaced by a sense of partnership. I still had my navy blue door, my brushed brass house numbers, my decorative rocks, and my Honda Accord, but now I also had something more valuable. A community that felt like home, not because of how the houses looked, but because of how the people treated each other. On a warm evening in April, I was walking my dog through the neighborhood when I passed by Patricia's old house. A young family had bought it after her conviction, and they'd painted the front door a cheerful yellow. Their kids were playing basketball in the driveway, and the dad waved as I walked by. "Beautiful evening," he called out. "Sure is," I agreed. "We love this neighborhood," he continued. "Everyone's been so welcoming. And the HOA is great, nothing like some of the stories you hear." I smiled. "Yeah, we've got a good thing going here. Took some work to get it right, but we got there." He nodded and went back to playing with his kids. I continued my walk, thinking about his comment. We love this neighborhood. That was what it was all about, really. Creating a place where people felt safe, respected, and part of something bigger than themselves. The lawsuit, the investigation, the criminal charges, the restitution, all of it had been necessary to root out corruption and abuse. But the real victory was what came after. It was the trust we'd rebuilt. It was the systems we'd put in place to prevent future abuse. It was the culture of participation and accountability that now defined Meadowbrook Estates. As I walked back toward my house, the sun setting behind me and casting long shadows across the perfectly maintained streets, I felt genuinely grateful. Grateful for the neighbors who'd stood with me. Grateful for Robert Chen's legal expertise and willingness to take on the case. Grateful for Derek's leadership and Rachel's financial diligence. Grateful even for the experience itself, as stressful as it had been, because it had taught me so much about courage, community, and the importance of standing up for what's right. My phone buzzed with a reminder about the next board meeting. We'd be discussing proposals for upgrading the community center and reviewing bids for a new landscaping contract. Routine stuff, but important. The kind of boring, responsible governance that keeps a community running smoothly and doesn't generate lawsuits or criminal charges. I headed home, where Sophie was waiting. We'd moved in together a few months earlier, combining our households and our lives. She'd brought her cat and her collection of veterinary textbooks. I'd brought my furniture and my hard-won wisdom about HOA governance. "How was the walk?" she asked as I came through the door. "Good. Ran into the new family in Patricia's old house. They're happy here." "Of course they are. You helped make this place worth being happy about." I shrugged off the compliment, but inside I felt its truth. Not because I'd done it alone, but because I'd been part of something important. I'd been part of a community that had decided to be better, to demand better, and to build better. The navy blue door that had started it all closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thunk. Inside my house, in my community, in my life, everything was exactly as it should be. And if another Patricia Hendricks ever tried to turn Meadowbrook Estates into her personal fiefdom, well, she'd quickly discover that we'd learned our lesson. We'd found our voices, and we weren't giving up our community to anyone. That night, Derek called to let me know that the Arizona HOA News, a publication that covered homeowner association issues statewide, wanted to do a feature article on Meadowbrook Estates. They'd heard about our successful reform efforts and wanted to highlight us as a case study for other communities. "What do you think?" Derek asked. "Should we do it?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. "If our story can help even one other community avoid what we went through, or give them the courage to fight back against corruption, it's worth sharing." The article came out a month later, a 6-page spread with photos of the neighborhood, the new board, and yes, my navy blue door. The headline read, "How One Homeowner's Fight Against an Unjust Lawsuit Reformed an Entire Community." It was a fair and accurate account of everything that had happened, from that first threatening letter to the criminal convictions to the positive changes we'd implemented. The article generated a surprising amount of response. We received emails from homeowners across Arizona and even from other states, people dealing with their own HOA nightmares and looking for guidance or inspiration. Derek and I, along with Robert Chen, put together a sort of how-to guide for homeowners facing similar situations. We covered the legal rights of homeowners, the fiduciary duties of board members, how to request financial audits, and how to organize communities for reform. We posted the guide online and made it freely available. Within a few weeks, it had been downloaded thousands of times. We started getting thank you notes from people who'd used it to challenge improper assessments, demand transparency from their boards, or even uncover corruption in their own communities. It felt good to know that our experience, as difficult as it had been, was now helping others. That was something Patricia and her cronies had never understood. Leadership isn't about power or control or enriching yourself. It's about service. It's about making things better for everyone, not just yourself. As summer approached, I reflected on how far I'd come. 3 years ago, I'd been a new homeowner, excited about my first house and naive about HOA politics. I'd thought I could just keep my head down, follow the rules, and be left alone. I'd learned the hard way that sometimes following the rules isn't enough when the people in charge are corrupt or arbitrary. But I'd also learned that ordinary people have more power than they realize. When you stand up, when you organize, when you demand accountability, you can change things. You can take on the bullies and the corrupt officials and the petty tyrants, and you can win. Not every story has a happy ending. I understood that. Sometimes the bad guys get away with it. Sometimes fighting back costs more than it's worth. Sometimes you lose despite being in the right. But in this case, in our community, in Meadowbrook Estates, we'd won. We'd exposed corruption, removed the corrupt officials, recovered misspent funds, and built something better. My navy blue door had survived, and so had the principle that homeowners have rights and that those rights matter. As I sat on my patio that evening, Sophie beside me and a cold drink in my hand, watching the Arizona sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, I felt a deep sense of peace. The battle was over. The war was won. And life, finally, was exactly as it should be. The community barbecue that year was the biggest yet, with nearly every household represented. Kids swam in the pool while adults mingled and laughed. The board gave out awards for best landscaping, most improved property, and best community spirit. It was hokey but heartfelt, a celebration of everything we'd built together. Derek, in his remarks, made a point of thanking everyone who'd stood up during the difficult times. He mentioned me specifically, which was embarrassing but also touching. "Zachary could have moved," Derek said. "He could have paid the bogus fines and kept his head down. Instead, he fought back, and in doing so, he saved this community. We owe him a debt of gratitude." People applauded, and I felt my face flush. Sophie squeezed my hand and whispered, "You earned this." Maybe I had. Or maybe I'd just been stubborn and lucky and surrounded by good people. Either way, standing there in the late afternoon sun, surrounded by my neighbors and friends, I felt like the richest man in Arizona. The navy blue door, the Honda Accord, the brass house numbers, the river rocks, all the things that had supposedly violated community standards and justified a lawsuit, they were still there. They'd always been fine. It had never been about any of those things. It had been about power and control and greed. But we'd taken that power back. We'd restored control to the community where it belonged. And we'd replaced greed with service and transparency. That's the real story of Meadowbrook Estates. Not about a lawsuit or corruption or criminal charges, though all of those things happened. It's about a community that found itself, that discovered its strength, and that chose to be better. And it started with a navy blue door and a homeowner who refused to back down. Years from now, when new families move into Meadowbrook Estates, they probably won't know the full story. They'll just know it as a nice neighborhood with a well-run HOA and friendly people. And that's fine. That's exactly what it should be. But those of us who lived through it, who fought the fight and won the victory, we'll remember. We'll remember Patricia Hendricks and her petty tyranny. We'll remember the moment we discovered the corruption. We'll remember the special meeting where 200 homeowners stood together and said enough. And we'll remember that when it mattered, when our community needed us, we didn't look away. We stood up. We fought back. And we won. That's a story worth telling. That's a story worth remembering. And that's a story that hopefully will inspire others facing their own battles with corrupt HOAs or petty officials or anyone who tries to abuse their power. Because at the end of the day, that's what this whole experience taught me. You have more power than you think. You have more support than you know. And when you stand up for what's right, when you refuse to be bullied or silenced or intimidated, you can change the world, or at least your little corner of it. And sometimes, that's enough.